Good morning still, everyone. Lovely to be in the room and meet some new faces already. Lovely to be talking to the virtual world as well. My name is Dr. Fred Paterson. I'm an Associate Professor of Sustainable Business and Clean Growth at the University of Derby Business School. I think I'm going to change the kind of tone, the perspective a little bit in this talk from hearing about all of these fabulous projects that the presenters so far have talked about today. I'm going to give you a little bit of a whistle-stop personal perspective, whistle-stop tour over the last 60 years or so, and hopefully provoke a little bit of thinking and reflection in you. And you might be entertained by at least one or two of the slides in here today. Of course, like everyone today, there's a whole set of academic papers and projects that I'll come back to in a little while. But I want to just kind of provoke some thinking and take you back to 1962 when Rachel Carson published Silent Spring. And I would say that's a transformational moment in environmentalism. 1962 happens to be my birth year. So in some ways, I would say the whole trajectory of my life reflects a growing awareness around environmentalism in all of its different kind of scopes, our challenges with the climate and the environment, and how we have come to understand our role as humans on the planet. Rachel Carson was a very well-respected academic who began studying the effects of DDT as a pesticide in the food chain. And in that late 50s, early 60s period, she was vilified by the academic and the commercial industrial powers that be, because she was making the case that the use of these pesticides was having not only a detrimental effect on the environment that it was applied to, but it was affecting the food chain and having cancerous and other negative effects on humans as well. Sadly, she died not too long after this period and wouldn't have seen the enormous impact that transition made. And the transition, I think I would argue, is that up until that point, we had viewed science, technology, innovation as an inevitable good in the world. And at this point, Rachel was beginning to challenge that orthodoxy, that not everything that is being done in the name of industry and commercial life and human activity was necessarily going to be good for the planet, the environment, nature, and indeed ourselves. She had great courage to stand up to that and had prepared very carefully as an academic to justify the case that she was being challenged on. And in that period, so as a child of the 60s, this is the kind of thing I might have seen in some of the kind of the books and magazines, the comics and so on that I was reading in that era. The future was seen as kind of shiny and technical. Here we have the crazy idea that people might be driving along a road in a driverless car and be able to kind of watch videos along the way. Buildings on stilts, roadways on stilts. These things in the 1960s to a young kid were fantastical. This was the view of the future that was being created. He was one of my heroes from the 60s. Some of you here might be too young to even know who this person is, but Captain James T. Kirk. And this communicator that he had didn't have wires, which seemed an absolutely kind of fabulously ridiculous concept in 1966 or 68 when I was watching these programs. Captain Kirk's communicator didn't have pictures. So we've stepped beyond this view of the future. This was meant to be hundreds of years into the future. And in some senses, this notion of innovation and technology being a force for good has come to fruition in our lifetimes. However, on the back of Rachel Carson's work and all sorts of other activity, we came to the 70s and all of a sudden we were becoming aware that there was significant negative impacts on the environment and the climate, largely at that point, I think, driven by concerns about population growth. And as a 17-year-old sixth form student, so not in 72, I hasten to add. That was when this publication was published. My geography teacher, the fabulous Jim Sidley, brought this document for us to review and said, boys, it was a boys' school, we need to look at this seriously. We need to take seriously the claims of the environmentalists that we are doing serious damage and that by the early 2000s we'll be in big trouble. And this seemed like a radical idea in the 1970s to a 17-year-old whose main urgent need for action was to have a haircut, I think, judging by this picture. The tone was changing. In the 70s, we had Anita Roddick, who founded the Body Shop with the radical notion that beauty products shouldn't be tested on animals that would subsequently die or have really detrimental effects to their well-being. That was a radical thought in 1970. She also had the notion that people shouldn't necessarily need to buy products and throw away the containers, and that you could go back to the Body Shop and get a refill for the products. In the mid-70s, I remember my girlfriend at the time coming back with this fabulously fresh-smelling, I don't know what it was, some kind of perfumed beauty product, but then going back to the shop and refilling it. And this was a radical idea in the 70s. Anita Roddick was a complete forerunner in the notion that business can do good. Because as we saw going back to the large corporations associated with Rachel Carson's study, at this stage, the notion that business was there to make profit was still absolutely predominant. Into the 80s, and we get the notion from Grow, Harlan Brundtland and the Common Future report that not only are we affecting the environment, but this is a system issue, that the issues to do with poverty, gender equity, wealth distribution are intrinsically linked to environmental concerns. And I think there's no, this is not an accident that many of the heroes and inspirational provocateurs in this are women, by the way. There's a longer conversation about that. Into the 90s, and there are larger companies like Interface and the wonderful Ray Anderson, who had read Paul Hawken's Ecology of Commerce, who suddenly said, we need to radically change how we do business. And so what they did is, rather than sell people flooring, they leased it to them and said, we will look after your flooring, you'll pay us a lease for this. Floor tiles become very popular because we can shift them around from areas which are high use, and we then move those into an area underneath a cupboard or a desk, and move less well used tiles into that area, so that we don't need to replace the flooring every 3 years. Perhaps we replace it more partially over a longer period, and that becomes not only a cost effective, but it's a new way of thinking about doing business. And the key thing here is that this is a mindset shift of the whole business model that impacts not only the company and its workforce, but the customers and the suppliers. So in this 90s period, we're getting to that stage where we're thinking about how we radically change and shift the way we do things. Still into the early 2000s, we have the Inconvenient Truth movie that was Al Gore's swan song. So he didn't succeed in becoming the American president, but from the 80s, he had been championing environmental causes. And I guess the point here is that still 2006, I think it was 2007, it won an Oscar for this documentary, one of the highest grossing documentaries of all time. At this point, the purpose of this movie was still to convince climate deniers. So this is less than 20 years ago. So for some people, this is an obvious truth and something we need to be acting on, but for a vast proportion of population and industrial and political decision makers, this wasn't a given less than 20 years ago. So in the 6 billion year history of the planet and the 200,000 year history of humankind, in my lifetime, we have come to a realization that we are impacting negatively on the planet. With at the back of this a view that science and innovation is an inevitable positive. So in this period, we're beginning to shift our mindset. You'll all be familiar with the SDGs. the lady on the right-hand side here is Christiana Figueres, who's one of the great heroes of all history, I would say, who, after the negative outcomes of the Copenhagen climate conference, shifted the dial. A lot of it was to do with her perseverance and the soft skills that she used in badgering and cajoling and arm twisting the people who were negotiating their country's position, actually to commit to the Paris Agreement. And she would note the notion that although technical solutions, we've been hearing this morning about some brilliant technical solutions, but actually the engagement of people and the soft skills required for that are absolutely crucial. Then we have Paul Hawken again and the very important project Drawdown. If you're not familiar with it, you must look it up. What this says essentially, so we get into the kind of I think it was 2018 that this was published, so that's not very long ago at all. We have the solutions. We have the solutions to solve our climate change problems. This is very much focused on climate. We have the solutions. Very interesting about that analysis is that if we put together the solutions related to food chain, agriculture, land use, and the impact of education for women and girls, they are greater than the solutions related to technical solutions and approaches to transport, cities, and materials. So the solutions, the largest part of the solution frame isn't technical. This is not to deny all the technical stuff is really important, but a lot of it's to do with our practices in society. More recently, in the last decade, we've got in the UK an enormous kind of attention on public policy to net zero and what we as a nation need to be doing in terms of our industrial policy. So that's driving things forward. We're fortunate in this country from 2008 to have a Climate Act, which is driving the government to do this. And we can argue about how successful our various governments have been since 2008 in driving things forward. And there is now plenty of support for business. I work a lot with SMEs. And I think there's a very different picture amongst corporate businesses and how they are contributing to climate resolution and environmental regeneration. But there is lots of support, increasingly in the last probably only 2 or 3 years, for smaller business. That includes the kind of funding that we have within our kind of local areas. This refers to Derby and Derbyshire, Nottingham and Nottinghamshire. I know there are similar projects. Rafi mentioned Andrew Reeves and his project in Leicester. There's lots of funding which is supporting, helping businesses to make this transition and be part of the solution. So here's the reflective piece. I would say up until the turn of the current century, a lot of our attention, particularly as researchers, but also as policy practitioners, on the left-hand side here, is on problem definition. So it started with, are humans even affecting the climate? Okay. Plenty of attention on the solution frame. Well, how do we innovate? Much less attention on adoption. What I would argue is now that set of priorities is shifting, and rightly so. It's not to say, as we've seen in some of the presentations already, that we continue to need to look at the problems and look at an ever more granular way at the problems. Actually, the important shift is about change at pace and at scale. So if we accept the drawdown principle that we have all of the solutions that we need, that's not to say that we can't optimize and bring in new solutions. If we have the solutions already that we need to address climate and environmental challenges, surely the emphasis needs to shift towards transformation and adoption. And I guess I would argue, and I can say from my experience of working in one university, and this is for your reflection in other universities, even where we've got very good, as we've seen this morning already, some really brilliant technical solutions, very exciting to see the eco shopping and the heat from mines work of colleagues this morning. How much attention do we as academics pay to actually going from the successful creation of the technology, the innovation, to that becoming a mainstream at scale and at pace implementation? And what's our role in that? So I'm going to whiz through just a little bit of what I do, not to dwell on this. So for me, sitting within a business school, my background is in leadership development and system innovation. So now I believe that those of us who are involved with inspiring people, actually that's all of us, we don't just need to be leadership developers to do that, need to think about what's different about the leadership that we require currently with this challenge in order to move at pace and scale. And we've done some, we've done some work on what the kind of the competencies of sustainability leaders and why they are different from very successful organizational leaders. We've looked at the trajectory, particularly in this case, in studies of how SMEs shift from being just interested in energy efficiency through developing new products and then becoming leaders in their sector. And we've done some really interesting work across the region with the East Midlands Chamber to look at the uptake of businesses who are delivering low carbon goods and services. Interestingly, here's a proper trend from 7 years ago now. We from a survey of the East Midlands Chamber, their regular quarterly survey of regular businesses, 7 years ago, 16% of businesses said that they were delivering or getting turnover from low carbon goods and services. 16%. We thought that was high. In the last survey this year, it was 45%. Now these businesses might be doing tiny little things with low carbon, but it's showing the market entrants are growing year on year. So there's a massive trend. So what am I doing? I believe communication is a big part of it, very practical projects, including our low carbon business networks. If you know businesses that want to connect with other businesses across this whole region, we've got some down in Leicester there. We've got some great resources that are very practically kind of simply orientated for aimed at small businesses and projects that try to bring the technology that corporate larger businesses might expect to see in their factories. In this case, the kind of monitors that allows SMEs to monitor not only energy and heat, but air quality, light, and movement around workplaces to improve not only energy efficiency, carbon reduction, but to improve the well-being of their employees. So affecting the air quality so people are more productive and healthier. Dashboard is very important. Being an in-house change agent, so all of us, are we influencing our other colleagues who aren't directly engaged in innovation? So I use this slide a lot with small businesses, and we know we've all coming off the back of COVID, and we're now facing a recession in the UK, certainly, and probably globally. So it's very easy for us, even those of us who are fully immersed in this arena, to forget that this tidal wave of climate change is going to immerse us if we don't act now at pace and at scale. That's not to be a doomster. This is the last slide. Because I think if we go back to those images in the 1960s, which were shiny and tech, and there weren't many potted plants on the Starship Enterprise. I think what we're seeing already today, but behest upon all of us in our various disciplines, is not only to do the really important work of checking things out and developing the innovations in all our different ways, but is to reimagine the future for the next generations. Because we know how powerful that is. Those images of the future of the driverless cars and the wireless telephones are already with us from my very early use. So what we achieve now, and brilliant to see, some of those the projects earlier on, the importance of creating that vision of the future, not only the technical research work, but how we communicate that at pace and at scale in order that this transition can be achieved is down to us all. I hope that's provoked some thinking. Thank you very much.